This episode contains stories of trauma related to domestic abuse. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat 988lifeline.org. Welcome to It's Your Story to Tell. I'm Megan and I am here with Rhea, and I'm really excited about the topic that we're going to be covering today. We're going to be talking about toxic relationships and how to start using your boundaries to improve your relationships. So thank you so much for joining me today. I'd love to share with you a little bit about Rhea and kind of her background, why I feel like she is so important to sharing this message with you. So Rhea, and it's a long list. So I just, if I look at my notes, it's because she has an amazing background and it's a lot to remember. So she is a believer, a wife to a firefighter. I'm so thankful for your husband and his service. It's such an underappreciated, our police, our firefighters, our healthcare professionals who are on the front line, and just what they go through every day to be there for us. And so thank you for, being there for him, because I'm sure it's important that he has such a supporter in his background. You are a mom to 6. Yep. Impressive. You do not look like you could be a mom of 6, so well done there, taking care of yourself. And you have a daughter-in-law that you love and have a really connected, special relationship with. You are a speaker, a writer. You have 2 books in the works, so you are going to be getting those out soon. Yes. You have started a podcast called Rise, which sounds so amazing, and we will definitely link so you guys can check that out. But tell me what RISE stands for.
Okay, so RISE stands for Restored, Inspired, Strengthened, and Empowered.
Wow.
And that is how I want every single woman to feel after they listen to my podcast or, been able to have an interaction with me or learn something amazing that God has taught them. Oh.
So amazing. I really love that. And you are a perpetual learner and always looking to put things that you learn into action. And you're passionate about helping women do the same. You are a coach, and you have coached in many different things, but you are certified as a domestic violence advocate. You are just about through a new certification that's a Christ-centered domestic abuse facilitator, and that's called Her Journey.
Yes.
And that's really exciting. And then you've coached people on marriage, abuse, addiction, and that's because you have so many different things in your background, really, that you have overcome. And I am just so thankful that you're here with me. I love that you are determined to show people just the light and love of God and bring hope and inspiration to them. There's many facets of your story, and we only have about an hour together. But I would just love if you would start kind of walking us through these different aspects of your life that are now qualifying you to help people really navigate hard things. And I know, we're going to talk a lot about toxic relationships, but I think it's really important that we acknowledge that we don't end up in toxic relationships just coincidentally. Things happen in our lives, in our childhood, that then create narratives that we then act on. So would you walk our audience through a little bit about your story and where for you did it start in your own life that you believe led to having toxic relationships?
That's the big question, right? It's one that I've asked myself quite a bit. Where did this all start? Especially as a mom now, because you want to protect your kids from things. And so I want to protect my kids from what I went through. So I'm always trying to look back and figure that out. And I've been doing a lot of healing, a lot of learning, and a lot of healing over the last 5 years. And in all of that, it's kind of led me to some memories and some realizations. When I was young, I had a caregiver in my life that was an important part of my life who had some toxic things in their background that they then brought into raising me, right, and caring for me. And so when I was really young, when I was 5, actually, I was dropped off at my aunt's house for her to help kind of straighten me out and raise me for a little while. And I think at that moment, it was kind of instilled in my mind, you don't have this thought as a 5-year-old necessarily, but it just gets planted that, well, I don't really matter. I don't really have a voice. I have no say in this. You know, I didn't want to go live with my aunt. I wanted to stay home, but just to feel like I don't have enough value to be kept at home. So I really think it started at a young age, but that realization didn't come right away. It took some digging from me to kind of get back to, oh, that's where this all started.
I think that's such an important recognition. If people have listened to my podcast, which was episode 1, I talked very similarly, and I had a memory from about the age of 7 that I was able to identify that started putting these beliefs and values, the way I saw myself, in a perspective that was not healthy. It was not in line with who God created me to be. And it wasn't easy finding where that kind of started. But I think it's so important that we start asking ourselves these questions, because I don't believe we can really start healing until we can get down to the root of where did that come from, because we have to be able to go back into those places and acknowledge, but then also speak truth about who we are and who God created us to be. So I thank you for sharing that. And, you know, you've now done that work, you located that, but like you said, it came later on in your life. So those values, the way you saw yourself, would you say that continually impacted you in the relationships that you had with others?
Yeah. So from the start of that, and then just kind of, you know, continuing through childhood, that caregiver, without intending to, and I have to believe that person did the best that they could with the tools that they had. It's in my heart to expect that, to expect the best out of somebody. Mm-hmm. And I think they just didn't have the tools to do any better. But then anytime that I would try to speak up for myself, it was met with a reaction that I didn't like. It didn't feel good. So then I would just learn to stifle my voice. And I say I taught myself, but I didn't really teach myself. It was my environment that I was learning from, that it's better to just not speak up for yourself. It's better to just be quiet. And then that kind of continued through some teenage years when I got into is it okay to launch into this part of my story?
Yeah,
or you want me to focus on the question?
No, go for it. Wherever you feel good to go.
So then in my teenage years, I got into a really predatory relationship, is what I would call it, with someone who was 10 years older than me. And so there was sexual abuse there for 1.5 years. And looking back on that now, I've done so much healing from that. And I'm a big advocate for EMDR therapy that has helped me to work through all of that and come out feeling just strong and empowered and healed. And all of the ick from that is gone now when I think about those memories. And I credit EMDR therapy and a good therapist and God for helping through all that. But I've been able to recognize that when it first started, there was that piece of, oh, just keep quiet. You know, I would try to speak, I don't want this, I don't like this, and it wasn't listened to. So then I just learned to just keep quiet and just shut up. And so that went on for 1.5 years when I was a teenager, and that was it it was something that I buried for a really long time. But once it opened up, which it did in nightmares for a while before I ever got help with it, then I realized just how damaging that was for me to just have it instilled over and over and over again into me that I didn't have value and I didn't have a voice, which obviously now I know is just what I was believing. That's not true, right?
Right. Our beliefs, though, create the actions that we take, and it also puts us into circumstances that are in line with our values, right? Yeah. So if we believe something, we are going to find people that reiterate back to us. And that is what is so difficult about trauma and having these really hard things that we go through, is that because we then keep bumping up against more and more trauma because of our own beliefs, and it's a really hard cycle to break. You know, you talk about how we pass things down, and you know, I had good parents that were trying their best too, and there were still things that happened in my life, and then because I didn't deal with them, I passed them down. And I talk about that with my son, who's going to be 21, in episode 2 of the podcast, of how we pass things down. And, you know, I think it's so important as women and moms to recognize that things that happen, we experienced harm, but we have a choice. And we can either choose to heal and do our work and pass down healing, or we can choose to not face these hard things, and then we're going to pass those things down too. Yeah. And I hope that you, if you are a woman, a mother listening, and you've experienced something really difficult that you feel is prohibiting you from being the parent that you know you have the capabilities of being, that you would be encouraged and that you would not feel shame, because our shame keeps us from being able to make a different choice. And one of the things that a mentor and coach helps me with is that when you know better, you can do better. Yeah. And you talked about that. And so we're here just to say, you know, we want to give you an increased awareness, and also give you ideas on how you can move forward. And because we have to take personal responsibility for our own lives, even though we've had really hard things happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to add that if you have gone through anything hard that is still there, whether it's coming out in nightmares or whether it's coming out in your daily life, or you're being triggered and maybe you don't even realize that you're being triggered. Maybe it's, you know, just you're reacting a certain way and you don't know why you're reacting that way. If you have something that you've buried like I did, don't wait. Please don't wait to go get help for it. And you don't have to go with the first person that you talk to. If you seek therapy, you seek counseling, you don't have to, okay, I talked to this one person, now I'm stuck with them. If it doesn't feel like a good fit, you can, you know, keep talking to other people until you find a good fit, but do that work early on. Because what I did is I waited. Oh my goodness, it was like...
Me too. Me too. 37 years of my life. Like, I just decided I'm going to keep shoving it down and not deal with it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, I don't even know the number of years, but probably 20 years later is when I finally was like, oh, this is a problem. And what happens is, instead of it being a wound that you can just, you know, stitch up and heal, it becomes an infection that then is kind of deep down in there and it's oozing, and you have to clean it out. And for me, I think it would have been almost easier to deal with it right away than to go back years later. Then I had a family and I had a husband and I had a job and all these responsibilities, and to try to navigate through all of these memories that then got opened up and all of the symptoms and everything that came from that, it just is so much better. So I'm asking you to consider getting help sooner than later if you can, and just start with telling a trusted friend or a loved one, because it will make a world of difference versus waiting till years down the road.
Yeah, and that's the whole idea behind It's Your Story to Tell, is just empowering women to be willing to get vulnerable, because it is the most uncomfortable thing to do, but it is the most essential thing to do. And it's also, I love that you talk about being thoughtful about who you share your story with. And if something doesn't feel right, that you don't stay there. And that's part of, trauma and quieting your voice and putting yourself below others is definitely one of those symptoms of having gone through trauma and having false beliefs about yourself. And so when you are opening up to people, it's this opportunity for you as well to begin trusting yourself again and listening to that still small voice that you've been silencing, because it's going to help guide you to what are the best ways to deal with your trauma. You love EMDR, and I think that's amazing. I have known lots of people who have had great success with that. For me, I needed a mentor and a coach. I had gone through so many years of counseling, but for me, it was just I wasn't progressing. And so when I tried something different, I found a way that helped me to be able to move forward. And so not getting stuck in that, I think, is such a key component to this journey. Yeah. So,
and I did 2 years, I think, of talk therapy once I really made a decision to get help for years and years of trauma. And before that, I'd had a couple years here and there of talk therapy, and it wasn't, I won't say it didn't work for me, but it was very slow progress. Right. And then I did EMDR therapy for almost a year with one therapist. And then the pandemic shut everything down. And so I stopped with her. And then now I've had another EMDR therapist. For me, the EMDR works much quicker than talk therapy did, and in just such a different way. But I've had 2 different therapists for that. I've had many different therapists over the years, and we even tried exposure therapy way back in the day. And that was not fun.
Yeah, it doesn't sound very fun. Especially, I'm just thinking about your story and toxic relationships and stuff. I'm not even sure how you do exposure therapy for some of those things.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, we won't go into that right now. But it's definitely been this journey of finding what helps me the most and what's going to work best. And I also will say that having a good support system makes a world of difference, because when I first started, my husband was on board and supported me, so he thought, but he didn't realize the storm that was coming once everything opened up, and then it became really hard for him, and so I had to reach outside of that and find other support people, and I had to set some boundaries of, okay, I just had a therapy session, I need some space, I need to go for a walk, that type of thing. So finding a good support system, but also being a good support system for yourself as you're going through this, it's all good tools to have, to try different things, find what works for you, and then do your self-care.
Right. Yeah. Well, and, self-care can be so many different things. And I focus a lot about self-care in the community of It's Your Story to Tell, because when you have gone through hard things, a lot of times it's because you don't know yourself, you're not listening to yourself, and self-care requires you to get to know yourself, to listen to yourself, and so it can be really uncomfortable. And in this day and age, let's just face it, success in the world looks like being busy, not taking time for yourself. Like, I'm so proud my kids had this. I didn't stop from 6 this morning until 10 at night, and it's like this badge that we wear.
The badge of honor.
Yeah.
Yes, but it's actually not healthy.
No, and it's destroying us and our families and our children. And so I had to really reframe and retrain the way I engaged in self-care, because I wasn't ever taught that. And so I'm so glad that you brought that up. And then community, and anybody who's been listening to It's Your Story to Tell's podcast or looking on our social media, that has definitely been, this is what It's Your Story to Tell is this community where you can find like-minded people to encourage you, because it is really hard to do this work, and there's going to be days you don't want to do it, and that's okay. But by being in an environment that values doing this work and finding healing will allow you greater chance of success in navigating it. So I think those are really important, and I love that we got to that before we kind of get in to the hard parts of your story and how they navigated, because I think if you are going through something, it's important that you start with equipping yourself before you dive into the deep end of really exploring the hard stuff. Because if you have not developed a supportive community around you, and if you don't have a counselor, a coach, a close friend, and you're not engaging in self-care, you are not going to have a great success going through this, and you're probably going to just create more trauma for yourself. So by setting these things in place first, I think people will have a lot more success in going through their own story and then rewriting it to be the one that they feel called to live, and that the purpose that they were placed on this earth to do. And so you talked a little bit about like where that belief was implanted, how, because you had this belief, it put you in these situations and relationships that kind of almost confirmed that belief for you. Out of those relationships, what do you mind sharing a little bit about kind of what you experienced as a result of those? You talked a little bit about sexual abuse, but what other things came into your life because of that?
Because of toxic relationships from the get-go?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of those, like, how much time do we have questions. I gave you a little snippet of the highlights of my story, which aren't really highlights. They're more like lowlights because they weren't high times in my life. But after I got out of, it wasn't really getting out of that relationship because it wasn't a relationship, but after I set boundaries and I closed the door with that, which was a really scary thing, and that'll be in my book.
Yeah.
But after that, about a year later, I found out that I was pregnant, and so I was a teenage mom, and I'm not blaming that on anyone other than myself, because I had made choices in that. My son was actually, I believe, and I will say, super hard to be a teenage mom, and I would not recommend it. However, my son was my angel. Mm-hmm. It was God, I feel like, saying, hey, I'm going to get you out of this life. Because not only had I been in that sexual abuse and everything with that, but I'd also been involved in some pretty heavy drugs. I used drugs as, I think, a numbing system, because I wasn't able to express the way that I felt, and so the way that I felt was so overwhelming to me. I couldn't handle it. As a teenager, you have so much going on already anyway, and all of these hormones, and life is so hard, and all of this stuff. And so I found out that drugs just make me feel better. So I got into methamphetamine methamphetamines pretty heavy for 4 years. And then when I found out that I was pregnant, I quit all of that. So that's why I say that he was my angel baby. And then, not to be confused with favorite child. My other kids are always trying to say he's my favorite child. I have no favorites. Yeah. But I do believe that God used that to change my life around. And so then that could be the pretty package that, just turns all of this around. But after giving birth and trying to turn my life around and do the right thing and being a teenage mom, and I did try to do all the things. I worked 3 jobs. I went back to school, all of these things to make a good life for him. And then I got into an abusive relationship. And it's so funny because even as I was in it, it's not funny, it's interesting. I don't like that word.
Yeah.
As I was in it, I was thinking, my parents didn't teach me this. They didn't teach me to put up with abuse. They didn't teach me to put up with somebody talking to me this way. I was raised in a home where my parents were married. They were fairly kind to each other. It was like the typical American family. We went to church every Sunday. It looked picture perfect from the outside, but there really wasn't a lot of messy stuff inside, except that there was trauma that was, what's that called? Generational trauma kind of being passed down. So I thought, my parents didn't raise me this way, to be talked to this way and be treated this way, so why am I here? Why am I allowing this? And I have to say that the whole time I was in that relationship, there was a lot of that confusion. Feelings of, this isn't right. I shouldn't be talked to this way. I shouldn't be treated this way. I shouldn't be putting up with these things being done to me or my kids. Yeah. And then these irrational thoughts, now I call them that, but at the time it just confused me of, but I'm in this relationship for this reason, or I had my best friend passed away right before I got into this relationship, and I met this person through my best friend's death. So in my 21-year-old mind that was grieving so greatly, I wanted to believe that the reason that my best friend passed away was to meet this person. And there has to be a reason for their death, right? It was so sudden. It was a car accident. It was unexpected. And so I wanted to have a reason for it, and I held on to that. And we find the funniest things to hold on to, the things that don't really matter when you're in a toxic or abusive or manipulative relationship. You just kind of latch onto something, or I latched onto something and held on to that. And so it was either that thought, or it was the thought of, by that time I had kids, from him. Well, if I leave him, my kids are going to be without a dad. And so there was all of these tug-of-war thoughts that would go through my head. But at the core of all that was, how did I end up here? My parents didn't teach me this. And I know statistically that a lot of women who are in abusive relationships had abuse in their childhood. And so that's what was so confusing to me, and what I kind of went back through and analyzed, because I have a very analytical mind. I like to try and figure out, how did this happen? Was exactly that. How did I get here if I had a healthy family growing up?
Yeah,
and
I can totally understand that, because that was so much of my story, and actually it created even more shame in me, because I'm like, I shouldn't be living like this. I shouldn't be experiencing this, because I didn't have this level of trauma that I would have expected to have this kind of result of my life. And, that's, I think, one of the reasons that it was so important that I started this podcast, was to kind of destigmatize that, like, big T trauma, little t trauma, like, none of that matters. It's like, how is it impacting you, and what is the result and the evidence in your life of how it's impacting you? And mine was just this, like, small thing that created, like, codependency and perfectionism and things like that then resulted in different relationships, and then trying to keep things hidden because I didn't want people to look at me different than, like, I did have this good family, and if they saw this, then, like, what is that saying? It's saying about them and all of these different pieces that keeping it hidden too because of my beliefs or wanting to look a certain way continued to precipitate more damage to me. And so it wasn't until I could just be honest with my own experiences and not trying to like relate it to anybody else's or compare it and just say like, this is clearly impacting me, right? And it's impacting my kids. And regardless of where it came from, I need to just face it and deal with it.
I didn't have that piece of wanting to make my family look good, probably because I had gotten into such bad drugs and lived this life of running away and being the black sheep child for so long that was, who cares? I've already made them look bad, right? But there was still this shame rolled up into it. That person secluded me a lot eventually, and it is a slow drip. It is not, and you know this, it's not something that happens overnight. If it was, you'd be able to see it so clearly and go, whoa, hold up, this isn't okay, I'm out of here. But it's this gradual breaking you down. Mine started with comments of jealousy and you're looking at that person, and then I would try to defend it, and then somehow this rolled into, breaking into another cycle and another one, and eventually it became calling me names and just berating me for not paying his phone bill or whatever. There were so many things that built up, but then it got worse and worse and worse and worse, and I was like, I'm not fat, I'm not stupid, all these things that he's calling, and then should somebody really be talking to me that way? What does the Bible say? Does God say all of these things? No, God doesn't say all of these terrible things about me, and I don't see anywhere in the Bible that it really says, sure, there's verses that say turn the other cheek, but I don't see verses that tell me that I should stay in a relationship where somebody is continuously beating me down emotionally. But then there's that piece of, but he hadn't touched me yet. So, comparison. Well, there's other women who have X, Y, and Z. It's so much worse for them. And just the silliest things would silence that voice inside me. Right. So,
well, and you had those moments of where you were clarity, right? Sure. And asking questions. And then you
swept away.
Yeah, right? And then and you talked about holding on to something, like some hope, or there has to be a purpose in this. And I can definitely identify with that. But I'll say there is no purpose for being in an abuse situation like that. There is, I don't believe God wants you to stay in a place that is not safe. And if you are being called names or made to feel awful about who you are, that is some of the worst abuse to try to overcome, even sometimes more than like the physical part, because this is a part where they are reprogramming your mind with these messages that are meant to now control you, so that it makes it harder and harder to get out, and you take on more and more of the responsibility and the blame. And that is where, you have given up all boundaries. You are allowing this person to cause you harm, which if you have children, then you're allowing it to cause them harm. And that was really hard for me when I actually accepted that my choices were also allowing this abuse towards my children, even if the hands were not, put on them. It was affecting them, and taking that responsibility and beginning to work. I also had a counselor that helped in the boundaries department, and that was while I was in it. Actually was working with both of us, interestingly enough. And, boundaries came really forced upon us some with DHS getting involved and me having to realize the significance. And like you were saying before, don't wait. I mean, eventually you will come to a point where you have to face this. Like you can't run forever. And so you're just extending the damage to yourself and to those that you love. And there's help, out there. And there's organizations, and we'll link to all of those different things. So let's talk a little bit. We just touched a little bit on, physical, emotional. Tell me a little bit about your perspective. For me, I was sharing how emotional abuse was so much more difficult for me because it's what became a controlling factor in my life, and it changed the way I actually thought. And when physical abuse was occurring, I knew that was wrong. But I really struggled with, am I actually the wrong one? Am I doing the wrong things? When it was the emotional, it wasn't as clear cut, like this is abuse or this is not. How was your experience? Because I know you face both emotional and physical, and we just want to be cognizant that not everybody's experience is always the same.
Yeah. And so interesting, just popped into my mind as you were talking, that with my husband, my now husband, and I,
there was even a different layer to that where it felt like emotional abuse. And I would say, but I can't leave because there's nothing physical, right? So we'll get to that in a little bit, but there's all these different layers and so many different situations, and everybody has their own story. Right. Everyone has a different experience. For me personally, the physical abuse started so small. It started with like pulling my hair. I don't want to trigger anybody. Just little things. And then amplified to a night where I really should have died. And then the emotional stuff and the verbal and the financial. There was control. There was gaslighting. I don't know if we need to talk about what that means, but...
Yeah, I think if you just explain a little bit about what gaslighting is.
Yes. So gaslighting is basically when somebody convinces you that what you know to be true isn't true. That's the best way that I know to say it is the other person is so skilled that they question you and they cause you to question your own reality, and they're so sure in their convincing of you or their argument with you that you start to say, wait, did it actually happen that way? And then it just turns into crazy town because you think that you're losing your mind because apparently you can't remember things right. So gaslighting basically in a nutshell is that. And so I experienced the gaslighting, the financial, all of the facets of abuse.
Right.
I get an award for. I hate to say it that way. I like to make jokes about things because it lightens the mood a little bit. I'm not really trying to make a joke about that kind of stuff. It's very serious to go through. But all of those things were experienced differently by me than the physical abuse. When I am healing from my trauma, and especially in the EMDR therapy that I'm doing, processing through the physical events is very different. The pain is very different. The belief that it formed in me is very different than particularly the verbal abuse. The verbal abuse where all of that was, like you said, meant to control and meant to make me believe that I wasn't anything. Well, not even that I wasn't enough, but just that I wasn't anything. I wasn't worth anything. It just hits very differently for me. Yeah. So, to answer your question, in my situation, I would say that one wasn't necessarily worse than the other, but that they affected me differently, and the healing is different. Yeah, from each. Yeah, if that makes sense.
No, I can totally appreciate that, and I think it's so good that we can share different perspectives because you may be feeling something totally different than what you and I even described. And so it's important to recognize there's like no one way to feel and there's no one way to heal, and that by tuning in to yourself, which is unfortunately so hard to do when you've experienced abuse because of the whole gaslighting. The experience is they take away your identity. And you have to, in order to survive, you stop listening to everything that comes up in you, because you're like, wait, it turns into a battle, it turns into, and so doing this work requires you to begin developing your skill to listen and acknowledge your inner voice.
Yeah.
And that will guide you. So I love that you shared that. And what else have you learned as you've gone on this journey of healing from really hard stuff?
Yeah, so we could take 5 hours to talk about my story, but I don't know that people really want to tune in for 5 hours. So in a nutshell, those things were major portions of my life and things that I really had to go back and get healing from. However, it's not the only part of what led into this issue of me, not having a voice, not using my voice. I had a voice all along. It was there. I just felt too much fear to use it. And kind of conquering that, it's been such a long journey that it would take a really long time to tell about all that. But something that I really do want to share is, this is just on my heart, it just kind of popped in. If you're going through something and you're hearing these stories, my story or someone else's story from your podcast, and you're thinking, I don't have anything that bad. My stuff isn't traumatizing, or my stuff wasn't abuse or whatever. Each of us has this gut feeling, and each of us has this, I don't know how to say it, but what's okay to us and what's not. And I spent a long time in my marriage trying to figure out, is this actually okay? Again, because there was no physical abuse, because he didn't outright call us names, and I would love to get more into that story depending on how much time we have, but my husband and I came from and he has given me permission to share this. He has given me full permission to share all this. We've done so much work. He has done an incredible amount of work, and our marriage is incredibly strong and healthy now. And a year and a half ago, I didn't think that I'd be saying that, but for about 8 or 9 years of our marriage, it was incredibly toxic. We were both very codependent, and we didn't even know what that word meant. You hear the word codependent and you think, oh yeah, okay, codependent, anonymous, whatever, that's what I thought. I'd heard of that group, and so I thought, yeah, that's them.
Right, yeah. That's covered all throughout podcast episode 1, where I was like, I'm not codependent.
Yes.
Someone else is like, oh yeah,
yes,
you are pretty much are the definition, like if you read it. So,
Exactly.
People are asking, I just like to say, if, codependency is basically like you will do for others at the expense of yourself. Like there is no acknowledgement, there's no boundaries. You're probably exhausted, anxious, overwhelmed.
Or in my situation, it was trying to control the situation, trying to control how I felt from it. I didn't want him to react a certain way. I wasn't able to release his feelings to him, because as soon as he had his feelings and his emotions, and I'm referring to my husband, then I felt fear because of my past. I felt just this incredible anxiety. Sometimes I would get so triggered I was back in a war zone just from him having this little edge to his voice, because he wasn't speaking to me in a kind tone. It was kind of extreme. When I look back on it, we both had to do a lot of work. I had to do a lot of work on my triggers and on setting boundaries, not only with him, but with myself. So I kind of went off topic a little bit, talking about the marriage stuff. My main point was that it isn't always very obvious what is okay and what's not okay. And I brought up my marriage stuff because specifically for years I thought that this is just something that I have to live with. This is just something that I'm married, and this isn't outright abuse. So I just have to be a good wife and, just stay and do my best and tell him how I feel. But then if he keeps, it was so muddy. It was so unclear. And I remember my biggest thing, I love clarity. I love to know, I want a game plan. I want to know exactly what I need to do. And then I'm golden. Until I have clarity in things, I often feel very overwhelmed. And in my marriage, I didn't feel clarity because it wasn't direct abuse, but it felt so bad to me. And so one of the things that I'm very passionate about other women understanding is that if it doesn't feel right to you, it doesn't matter whether other people think it's okay or not.
That is so good.
And that was kind of the point that I wanted to get to initially, was that if it just doesn't feel right, then just trust that. And no one else has to tell you that they agree or not. No one else has to tell you that you're right. If you feel like it's not okay, then listen to that and act accordingly, whether that's setting boundaries or leaving the situation or reaching out to somebody for help. But listen to it. Don't just stifle it. That's your voice inside that is so important. And the sooner you listen to it, the sooner you can become a healthier version of you.
Yeah.
So all of that really affected the lack of boundaries, the lack of voice that I had been using really affected my marriage because, like I said, there were so many things that just didn't feel right. The way that he would get angry and I would get triggered, or some of the things that he said when he was angry, they just didn't feel right. They weren't the black and white. He wasn't calling names. He wasn't doing anything that someone else would maybe listen to and say that's not okay, but to me it wasn't okay. I didn't want that in my home. I didn't want that in my family. And I had tried to express that, and I'm going to segue a little bit into a different subject matter here, but I had tried to express that to him for so many years, and he just wasn't hearing it. And my husband had his own stuff too. He had the way that he was raised. He had his own stuff that he was dealing with. A very small amount of tools that he was using. Again, I have to believe that he was doing the best that he could with the tools that he had. And with the boundaries that I wasn't setting, to be honest, I want to take ownership of that because I didn't realize that I could set boundaries and enforce them and follow through with them. And so I just didn't set boundaries. And it's almost like I gave him permission to walk all over me.
Right.
So he was using all of that stuff and just going along about his business, and in the meantime kind of re-injuring me instead of helping me to heal from the things that I had been through. And it was just a big toxic mess. And again, he knows all this, he's grown from it, but at the time he would not listen to me or could not listen to me. And so at some point I just reached my wit's end, and I had tried to set some boundaries, but I wasn't great at enforcing them. And
the enforcement part is really hard.
Yes.
Especially when you love someone, and you want to see the best in them. It's hard to, at least it was for me, to follow through. It felt mean.
For me, the big question was, can I? Am I allowed to? Does that make me a mean person?
Right.
Am I supposed to just lay down and let this happen?
Right.
And being in the church, I'm not faulting the church, but there is a lot of this encouragement of, I don't know how else to say it, but kind of being the good wife.
Right.
And turning the other cheek and just...
Forgive 70 times 7.
Yes.
But forgiveness is, again, it's for us. Forgiveness does not mean staying.
Yes.
And I agree with you. There when you are in the church, it can get very confusing on how do I honor God and follow these commandments and scriptures and things that he's laid out, and how do I have boundaries? Which is so interesting because the Lord has a lot of boundaries with us, right?
Absolutely.
And there's consequences to our decisions. We have free will. But when it comes to then going and putting those on others, that can be a struggle. And I was with you there on that. And I had a lot of hurt within the church and my own belief about things that actually kept me staying in a situation a lot longer than I should have. And I know that that's not just my story, that's many women's story.
Yeah. And the thing is with boundaries that we're not really putting them on others, we're putting them up for ourselves.
Right.
And there's a great book called Boundaries that talks about how, actually there's another one called Good Boundaries and Goodbyes. I hope it's
We're
okay
gonna
that I
link,
name drop on here.
we're gonna we'll link these because I think those
Great
good.
books.
The boundaries one is great. The boundaries in marriage is a great one. Boundaries with kids is a good one.
And teenagers. So there's lots of great books, and they talk about how a boundary is like a fence line. And if your neighbor just keeps stepping over your fence line and doing things to your yard that you don't want them to do, then that's crossing your boundary. And it explains it in a way that was really helpful to me to understand that a boundary isn't me saying, I'm going to change you. A boundary is me saying, I'm not okay with X, Y, and Z, and if you continue to do X, Y, and Z, then it's going to be a problem. Okay, here's an example of a boundary. If I'm riding in a car with somebody and they're driving really erratically and I feel unsafe because of the way that they're driving, then I can say to them, can you please stop driving erratically and keep the distance between the car that's in front of you, or stop swerving all over the road, whatever it is that they're doing. And then they have a choice to either, yes, I will drive safer and do what I'm asking, or they can continue to keep driving erratically, and then I now have another choice. So it's kind of passed back and forth. So now I have the choice of whether I'm going to say, please stop the car, I'm getting out, or if I'm going to continue to stay in an unsafe environment. And that is, for me, what boundary setting has been. It's not placing it necessarily on another person. I make a request. I say, here's my boundary. I would like you not to cross it. And if they continue crossing it, then I say, okay, and now here is my action. Right now I'm going to get out of the car. In the situation with my abusive relationship, my boundary enforcement was I'm leaving the relationship. And I had tried all the things to make the relationship work. As a matter of fact, there's a statistic about how many times women leave abusive relationships. I believe my count was 12. And that's pretty high compared to this statistic. I had tried so many times, and the final time, God just really was there and introduced the right people into my life to help me. So with that, I ultimately had to set that boundary, and then I had to continue setting boundaries because then I was stalked for 1.5 years. So I had to get a legal boundary, a legal document to help keep me safe, and then communication kept happening that was unhealthy. So I had to continue enforcing boundaries. There's no amount of work that I could have done on myself in that relationship that would have made things safe, that would have made him to stop being toxic and abusive and narcissistic. Because,
and just to clarify, this wasn't the relationship with your husband.
Correct.
This is going back
to my abusive relationship.
Originally.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I was in that relationship for 6 years, and even in that relationship, I had a lot of back and forth. What am I allowed to do? What am I allowed to set boundaries? So confusing when you're in it.
Yeah.
So in that relationship, setting the boundary meant leaving and not looking back, because there was no change, and there still to this day has been no change in that person. And I had to set a boundary with my caregiver relationship as well at some point, because it was just getting so hard for me. It was weighing me down and affecting me really emotionally every time that I was around this person. And I had set boundaries for years that were continuously crossed. And so then I had to set a very big boundary of, I'm not going to have interaction anymore. So that was, very limited interaction. And that was a really hard boundary for me to set with somebody who had been a caregiver to me as a child, but it was very needed. And it ended up with me being able to work through a lot of my stuff and get more emotionally healthy, and to work on forgiveness, which has been an amazing ride. A very difficult ride. Forgiveness is not something that comes easy if you've been really hurt, particularly from a young age. Yeah. And it's not something that you just flip a switch and it happens. For me, it's been an everyday choice. but it's just so good. God is using it for so much good. So that was another boundary that I had to set and enforce. And then in my marriage, this is the third one, where in this situation, I set and enforced boundaries, and I'm going to be fully transparent here. I kicked him out of the house. It was a big, I cannot do this anymore. I cannot stay in this house with you. It was, and I had tried setting smaller boundaries first that were still being crossed, and so this was like the big one. And him and I have talked about it. This is my husband that I'm speaking about now. Over the last year and a half, as our marriage has just healed, and he's done the work and I've done the work, and he has said that was kind of the turning point for him. He also said, I wanted to divorce you. And the only reason that I stayed was because of the kids. And it's a good thing we have kids, because otherwise we'd be divorced.
Yeah.
I think he was joking, but it was a God thing, really.
Sure.
I did so much praying during that time. After I set that boundary, and he was so angry, and I was so confused, and there were so many emotions, and I would just go out in nature, which I highly recommend. That is self-care, getting out in nature, going for a walk, sitting by a pond. Sitting by water is incredibly relaxing and good for the nervous system. Yeah. So I would go out in nature, and I would just pray and cry. And at one point, I remember so distinctly hearing God say that I was going to have joy no matter what. And either I was going to have joy with my husband in the marriage if he did the work, or I was going to have joy by myself without him if he didn't. And I just knew that it was going to be okay no matter what. And from that moment, I had peace. And from that moment, I think that's when changes started happening in our marriage. And I had work I had to do too.
Sure.
I'm not saying that it was all him, but for 8 or 9 years, I had been trying to do the work. And when the other person isn't, it is incredibly hard. So all that just to say that here's a third relationship where I needed to set and enforce boundaries. And that one had this incredible ending. And all of them are incredible endings, and they're needed endings. But some of them are kind of sad, right? Yeah. Sometimes you wish that you had reconciliation. And setting boundaries doesn't always make that happen. Sometimes there is no reconciliation. There is no change in that other person. My third example, by the grace of God, there was change in that person, and there was change in that relationship. And so it's just so incredible to look back on all of it and to look at toxic relationships, really, that I have had, and healing that has happened in me, but also the boundaries that I've had to set, and then what's come after that. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about talking about these relationships and just the different directions that they can go. But the main point in all of them is I had to start with me setting a boundary for myself.
Yeah, so good. I really love that the Lord showed you that you'll have joy either way.
Yeah.
And that was a really hard thing for me to recognize, is that we all have free will. And we can want something. My story with boundaries didn't end the way your story did, and yet I still have joy. And I have a husband now that I have the most amazing connection with, and that loves me and supports me. But I had to do the work first, because I would have never been ready for that. And I wanted it to look a certain way. I wanted my marriage to be healed, and I felt like, Lord, I've been asking you this. Please do it. And when he showed me that I needed to allow my ex-husband now to have his own free will. Because what abuse is when we don't allow for free will. Like for other people to do the things that they want, and we are in some way trying to control it. And for me, I was like, but I'm a good wife and I'm doing all these Christian things. And the Lord was like, yes, but you are wanting something and trying to force him into something that he's not wanting. And I had to let go of that and say, okay, but I still want a healthy relationship. And it didn't look like the way I thought it was going to look, but I still have the healthy relationship. So I love like that he showed you that. And as I have walked this journey and learned boundaries, I have lost friends that I thought we were best friends, you know, and when I had to make a decision that was in the best interest of where my family was at, and they didn't understand it, and then our relationship was lost, what the Lord showed me was the relationship you thought you had wasn't the relationship you really had. Because someone should be able to understand your heart and respect your position. And it doesn't mean that you get it all your way, right? Because you have to sometimes negotiate things. But there's some things that you just know, I can't do that now.
Yeah.
And so I am just so thankful for you sharing with our audience and just being so vulnerable about your journey and how the Lord has worked and healed and done so much in you. And I am so excited to bring you on as one of the coaches in the collective, because I think you are going to have such a ministry with women and helping them navigate this very difficult road.
Yeah.
And I know for me, in getting out, like you said, the statistics of getting out of these relationships is very high. I think it's like, I want to say it's 9. Don't quote me. It's like pretty high. And I was up there too in the number of times that I tried to leave. And it wasn't until I had somebody who could literally walk with me and help me untangle my mind and the lies. You talked about the confusion. And for me, having someone walk alongside of me that I could send a message to and say, this is what's happening, like, what's the truth? Because I couldn't even think clearly for myself. And then having someone who helped me discover my values. What is my identity? And all of that work is so powerful in changing your relationships from toxic to healthy.
Yeah.
And so it's pretty exciting, the collective and these women that are coming along to walk with women in their journeys and helping them to discover just how to be healthy. So thank you for joining me, not just on this podcast, but in this adventure.
And can I tell you, it was not something I did by myself. All of this stuff, and the place that I've made it to today, it was not alone. I am a very driven learner, and I read so many books, and I listen to so many podcasts and trainings, and I'm always trying to learn about the brain and how to better myself. But all of those relationships that I navigated through, in order to set those boundaries, I had a coach or a counselor or a trusted friend who helped me when I actually made the decision to ask my husband to leave the house. It was the craziest thing that day. I walked into a Bible study that I've never been to, an hour late. I didn't know I was an hour late. And so they were ending, basically. And I sat down and met a couple women, and then I was like, okay, this is a strange thing. I have a really heavy heart today, but I'm late to this Bible study. And it was just really weird the way everything turned out. But then this lady, at the end of it, she just asked me a question, and I don't remember what it was, but the floodgates opened. Wow. Total stranger. Had no idea who she was. And I said, I'm about to ask my husband to leave. And I don't know who this woman is, but she said, oh my goodness. And she comforted me and let me cry on her. And then she said, can I connect you to somebody who has experienced something really similar to what you're going through? And so then I was connected to this amazing friend of mine now who literally helped coach me through probably the first 6 to 8 months of things with my husband. And we also were able to get some couples counseling that was really good. So we had outside tools that helped us. But I can't tell you how many times I messaged her or called her and said, here's the situation. And she had already navigated through this a year or two before, and so she was able to help me. And now I'm able to help other women. Now I'm able to do that for other people because I've navigated through these things.
Right.
And I believe that God uses our pain, and God uses the things that we go through, and not only uses it to help one person, but he multiplies it. In the same way as, the loaves and the fishes that were just started out as a couple little things and then they were multiplied to feed the 5,000. I believe that God uses our pain in the same way if we just give it to him and just say, use me, God, and use this for your good, then it will multiply into thousands and more. For his glory. So.
Oh, that was so good. You just ended it, closed us out perfectly. If you are struggling, if you're in a relationship, if you don't know what to do, you can reach out. Either the best way is going to be going to the website, itsyourstorytotell.com. You can schedule a call. It's at no cost. I want to, whether you join as being a client, I want to help you get to the right resources and know that you're not alone. So please don't sit there wondering if someone can help you, because you can get help and you can change the life that you are currently in. And I just want to encourage you to be brave and to step out in something that feels so big and so uncomfortable, but that when you do, you are taking a step towards the life that you were created to be, the life that you know is inside of you, because you're questioning if where you're at is where you're supposed to be. So remember to listen to that still small voice that is wanting to direct you to find your purpose, because you were created with a purpose. You're loved and valued, and sometimes we need help in uncovering that. But that doesn't mean it's not there. Just like you said, your voice was always there, and finding it was the journey. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. And I do have resources on my website too. If women are feeling triggered, I have some panic resources on there of what to do if you're starting to have a panic attack. Some great songs that have spoken to my heart and have helped me in many different healing circumstances. Just things that I want to share with you that could just be a little bit of a tool for you. So we'll link that.
Yeah, we'll link up to those for you.
And thank you for you and the work that you are doing. Thank you for you. That should be a new thing.
I like that.
Not proper English, but I like it. Let's do it. But just the amazing work that you're doing and the heart that you have to help. It's incredible. And I know that that is God-given. And I know that you are so modest and you're not going to pump yourself up or talk yourself up in that way. But really, it is a gift from God, and he is using you.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
To God be the glory.
Amen.
He does turn our purpose, take our pain and turn it into purpose when we allow him. So we look forward to seeing you on our next podcast. Thank you for your time today, and have a blessed day. New podcasts every Friday. Listen and subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. If you're ready to start your own transformation journey, visit www.itsyourstorytotell.com. This podcast is intended only for educational, inspirational, and entertainment purposes. The purpose of this podcast is not to replace the counsel of a physician, professional coach, psychotherapist, or other qualified professional. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat 988lifeline.org.